Lucky you.
36 best holes in
Into
golf.
Alternate Shots podcast,
Arnie's Army.
where we talk about
Sandy.
golf, poker,
James Bond.
horse racing,
Double.
classic movies.
Zenyatta.
We have no script.
Down the stretch they come.
We are glad you joined us.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Ladies and gentlemen, from the Alternate Shots podcast, we are so very thrilled to have with us today our special guest, Mark Frost. Billy and I thank you, Mark, for joining us. Most folks would know you in the golfing world, Mark, for certainly the Grand Slam, the Greatest Game, and we're looking at the match. But you also wrote some the Hill Street Blues and Twin Peaks.
Yeah, Hill Street Blues, Twin Peaks, some Marvel movies. I mean, I've been all over the place. I'm actually writing a play now. I studied as a playwright as a kid. I went to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh and graduated as a playwright, and I'm writing my first play in 40 years. So I decided not to take a vow of poverty and become a playwright for good, but I'm coming back to it at the end of my career. It's kind of fun.
Well, Billy's a writer more so than I, because the nun slapped him on the wrist. Is it harder to be a playwright, a screenwriter, a script writer, an author? They're all different things. It's like match play and medal play.
Yeah, they're all different things. They all have their pluses and minuses. They all require different strengths. They all, as a baseline, you need to be able to tell good stories. You need to be able to create convincing characters. You need to be able to create a sense of drama and a sense of what are the stakes in the story, because that's what hooks people. They want to know who am I rooting for? What am I in for? So the principles are kind of the same, but it's like, you wear different equipment to play hockey than you do football. So it's like the accoutrement of the storytelling are different in everything. And I've done them all. I've done documentaries. I've done all sorts of fiction, nonfiction. I've been down the whole block.
Did you write the screenplay to The Greatest Game for the movie?
Yeah, and I produced the movie. Yeah.
Now, so not to get too sidetracked here, but writing a screenplay, because I looked into that and found it next to impossible.
Yeah.
You have to describe everything, right? It's got to be.
It's all about
with certain spacing.
It's about what you see, and what you hear. You hear the dialogue, but if you don't give the director or whoever's going to take over what we're supposed to see and be pretty specific about it, you're not going to end up with what you wanted. So I learned early on and I've directed a film too, and I've directed a lot of television. So you realize if it's not on the page, it often doesn't make it onto the screen.
Describe directing your own book, your own screenplay.
Well, I've done both. I've worked. I didn't direct Greatest Game. That was the late great actor Bill Paxton, really dear friend of mine, who did a wonderful job directing the movie. But we worked very closely together, and I shot a lot of the second unit stuff, and I worked with him in conceptualizing the film. We worked with what they call a storyboard artist to try to pre-visualize a lot of the shots. And particularly with what we tried to do with golf, because golf movies up until that point had basically stayed at arm's length and shot it as if you may as well have been watching a match on television. And our idea and my suggestion to him was, we got to get inside the heads of these golfers, and we got to get inside the mechanics of the swing, the flight of the ball, the feeling of what it's like to be in the zone, and also when you're crashing. And he and the cinematographer were really inventive and came up with ways, I think, that we hadn't seen golf depicted before.
Well, no, I think it's a groundbreaker, and it's a great story, of course. And the acting was great, was excellent.
Shia
LaBeouf.
Yeah. Shia did a great job. It was his first job as an adult actor. He'd been a Disney TV teen star, and he'd done one kind of teen movie. But they felt he was somebody who could carry the picture. And it's so funny. He came to the audition with a golf bag over his shoulder, saying he'd just come from the range, but he was carrying it the wrong way. It's always a tell. If the bag is in front of your shoulder, you go, "Sure you were, pal." Yeah, you were at the range. So I mean, he got the part, and I took him out to see what he could do. And I mean, he barely knew which end of the club to hold. He'd never swung a club before in his life.
Great.
So we had to put him in boot camp for 6 months with two different pros working on the swing. He never had to hit a live ball during. No balls were harmed in the making of this picture. It's all a CGI ball. With one exception, he does hit the big putt on 17. This was a blast. We shot the movie in Montreal, and we bought out an old venerable club on the west side of Montreal called Kanawaki. It's on an island out to the west of town. Looks a lot like the country club. It's the same vintage, a lot of the same kind of topography and trees and a similar style. So it worked really well as a stand-in for the country club. But to do that special shot on 17, that labyrinthine putt that goes in, we didn't have the access to the original. We had to create it. So we went into a park in Montreal and built 3 golf holes. And I designed a green with some little kind of hidden channels so that all he had to do was hit the ball over, like a dot 12 feet in front of him. And if he caught the speed right, we were able to track with the ball like 60 feet to the cup. That was a real shot.
But he couldn't miss it because you had the channel.
I mean, I wish I had that at my course, so.
We're big fans of Hitchcock. Are you the type of person when you're a director to go into the lens?
He always looked through the camera himself, according to what I've read.
I actually met Hitchcock once.
Wow.
When I was a 19-year-old rookie coming out to California, I got set up at Universal through an alumni who was 10 years older than me, a fellow named Steve Bochco, who went on to create Hill Street Blues and NYPD Blue. And
wise guy.
Yeah, he introduced me all around the lot. I got work right away. I was actually working on The $6 Million Man, if you could believe it. That was my first gig.
Lee Majors.
Lee Majors. So the Universal Commissary and the Universal lot had a lot of the flavor of the old time studios because they were shooting something like 32 hours of primetime TV a week, in addition to movies. So that's when Rock Hudson was making McMillan and Wife. Peter Falk was doing Columbo. I mean, there were always tremendous people to see in the commissary. And I walked in one day with Bochco. I think it was the first or second time I was there. And Alfred Hitchcock was shooting his last movie called Family Plot at Universal. Yeah, with Bruce Dern and Karen Black. And he would sit in the same booth every day in the corner. And I said, Steve, I got to go say hello. It's Alfred Hitchcock. He said, they say he doesn't like to be bothered. And I said, well, it's a once in a lifetime deal. I'm going to go over and say something.
Yeah.
So I remembered I had studied film like quite a lot. And I taught some film and I knew a little bit about Hitchcock's advance. And he had done a famous shot in one of his last silent movies called The Lodger, which is sort of based loosely on Jack the Ripper, where the hero is anxiously pacing back and forth. He's being falsely suspected of being the killer. And the people downstairs are looking up at the ceiling and thinking, what's the killer doing now? And he actually put a shot in with a transparent ceiling. So you saw the guy's footsteps walking back and forth. This was the kind of thing no one had ever tried before. So I went up and asked him how he did that shot in The Lodger. And he got instantly engaged and told me about they put their version of plexiglass, whatever that was, under the camera. It was only about 4 feet off the ground. And they'd hung you see the lighting fixture. So he shoots up past the lighting fixture, watching this guy go back and forth with the ceiling above him. And he was very gracious. I really liked him. It's kind of cool. One last Hitchcock story. I know we're here to talk about other things. Bel Air Country Club. And,
say that again. He lived where?
The 15th fairway of Bel Air Country Club in LA. And forever, lived there forever. And when he died, this started happening. And I've seen it every time I've played there. As you go down the 15th fairway, there is a giant, I guess what we would call murder of crows hanging out in his yard and house.
Oh my God,
Or maybe they just saw the picture and wanted to get even. I don't know.
it's unbelievable, that scene. And that man's mind was singular.
Yeah. I just rewatched Vertigo again, which is one of my favorite films. And it's just a work of staggering brilliance.
Right? Trouble with Harry, Vertigo, Rear Window, and The Man Who Knew Too Much.
And The Man Who Knew Too Much. Those were all those Universal films that he made in the 50s. And
right, and they were pulled they came back.
Yeah. Yeah. Vertigo was a flop when it came out, which is why he pulled it. And he gave it to television in the mid 60s, which is when I saw it as a kid.
Me too.
And was
Yeah.
Mesmerized by it.
Yep. Same with the man.
Enough Hitchcock stories, but
Well, Kim Novak and Jimmy Stewart's a tough combination. I thought Grace Kelly and Jimmy Stewart are unbeatable, but
And Jimmy Stewart and Doris Day weren't bad either on The Man Who Knew Too Much.
bad either. That's right. Que sera,
that's
sera.
incredible. You know, Billy told the story about Hitchcock as a 5-year-old. His father sent him to the constable in town. Did you hear that one?
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe that shaped his life. What shaped your life?
Being on the Art Linkletter show when I was in first grade.
Kids say the darndest.
Yeah. My dad, as you may or may not know, was an actor, and he was on Twin Peaks and had a really nice career. At the time when we moved out to LA, when he'd been the stage manager on Philco Playhouse, which was one of the 3 great anthology drama shows in the 50s. And when all that went away, when they stopped making shows in New York and it was no longer the center of the industry, everybody moved to LA. That's when it all started. And he was working at CBS. So I've always suspected that maybe he said something to the casting person, but they came to my elementary school and interviewed all of us in first grade, and they picked, I think there were 2 of us who ended up going. So I got that first experience, like, they actually pick you up in a limo from school, drove me to CBS Studio City. I killed I had a couple of jokes lined up. I was very comfortable. When you're behind you don't know where you are really. You're a kid, right? And there's 4 of us. And Linkletter comes in the dressing room, and he's got makeup on, but a big bib so he doesn't get it on his shirt. Really friendly, but he leans down. He had an enormous head. It was like the Macy's Day Parade, looking up at one of those balloons. And he had all of our answers written down on index cards in case some kid went up and froze, and a lavalier mic that he could kill. So I paid attention to that. And the kid next to me did exactly that. When it came time for him to answer a question, he went, and I saw Linkletter turn off the mic and turn his back to the camera and whisper the answer to the kid, and then step back, and the kid gave the answer. So I thought, so that's how it works. So anyway, I told a joke that got a huge laugh. He asked me if I had any pets, and I said I had some goldfish. And he said, what are their names? I said, Eenie, Meenie, and Miney. And he said, oh, really? What happened to Mo? I said, there ain't no Mo. And I think my dad had told me that joke. And the audience erupted. And I heard that sound, and I went, I think this might be what I want to do for a living. Not necessarily acting, but being in this kind of feedback loop with a group of people like that. From that moment on, I was a goner.
And on Romper Room for many years, and my children went on once or twice, but they didn't follow up with any best-selling books or anything like that.
I'll tell you another story. My roommate, when I was starting out, I had a couple of them who we all went on to have careers in the business, and one of them grew up as a caddy there, and went on to play maybe the most famous or second famous caddy in film history in Caddyshack, Michael O'Keefe.
Oh, sure. You knew Michael growing up?
Danny Newman. Yeah. Michael's
Yeah.
one of my closest friends.
Here's one you should get. You'll have nothing and like it.
Know that one. That night.
Yeah.
So that was like 1982. So Caddyshack, it was, it actually grew in popularity as time went on. And I started working Wall Street in 1982. All these guys were doing Caddyshack quotes. And I was like, I didn't know anything about it. I'd seen the movie once. And I didn't have, these guys had all the quotes down. So, I mean.
I knew Billy, his brother, who I'm sure you know, who's been, I think, been president of the club.
These books, they're legendary, and they cover such interesting eras or times and characters in golf. Were you to write a book today about golf, what would be the storyline, and who would you have in it?
The thing that I loved about the characters that I wrote about, obviously in Greatest Game, I didn't get to meet many of them, but I've met most of the people since then. It would have been fun to write about Jack and Arnie, who I both knew and admired greatly. I think the book that would have interested me the most, and he's been elusive and he's hard to pin down, would be Lee Trevino's story, which is a tremendous. It's like Francis, a guy who came up from nothing, who worked his way out of the cart barn at El Paso Country Club, and that famous time when they had the bet with Ray Floyd, and it's why I haven't told it in a while, so I got to see if I can remember it. There was a famous gambler, Titanic Thompson, who was a hustler who would come into town and he'd set pigeons up and he'd work it out, and he'd always find a ringer that he could bring in. And Ray Floyd, a champion professional golfer who had a fondness for gambling. So they talked him into coming down to El Paso for an event. He didn't know who he was going to play. He arrives just as he's getting out of the car, and this very friendly Mexican-American guy comes out to take his bag out of the trunk, wearing a caddy's overalls. And he says, yeah, you know anything about this guy I'm playing tomorrow? And it was Lee Trevino. He said, yeah, you're playing me. That gave him the confidence. At least that's what I heard, to try. And 2 years later, I think he wins the Open at Marion.
But anyway, we go back. So you'd write a book about Jack and Arnie, right?
Jack and Arnie, or Lee, I think. If I did meet Lee one day on a driving range, and he was very friendly. He knew the books, and we screwed around. He showed me a few shots, and I liked him tremendously. And I know Crenshaw fairly well, and he adores Lee Trevino, but he always worried about him that the difference between the public and the private Lee was so extreme that he worried that Lee might be battling depression, or that when he spent so much time alone, and really what he'd been battling was a lifetime of prejudice growing up. And he had developed that the Merry Mex persona as a way to kind of get over, when you talk to him, he's actually he's a substantial and serious guy. So I thought he would make a good subject for a real solid biography.
I for one appreciate the fact that the Greatest Game, you shined the light on Francis Ouimet, who I don't think got enough attention until that book for his accomplishments and his contributions to golf.
Country Club was the scene of the Open in 1913. That Open put golf on the front pages of our newspapers for the first time, and small wonder. Francis Ouimet, an almost unknown 20-year-old Boston amateur who had caddied at the Country Club, fired the shots heard round the world.
I couldn't agree more. And I heard about Francis when I was probably 14. I had a Scottish grandfather who lived in upstate New York in the Albany area. And he belonged to a fantastic little course. Tom Doak came in and redid it. He loved the course so much. It's the Country Club of Troy, New York. Walter Travis designed it.
Wow.
Fantastic almost a kind of combo parkland links course. We were out playing, and he told me about the story about this young caddy. I was a little bit younger than Francis had been, who had won the U.S. Open. So I heard about it at that age.
Wow.
So that's how I knew about him, and it had stuck in my head all these years. And I had introduced my literary agent to golf. He was a New Yorker. He had a place in the Hamptons, and we were out at this kind of down market driving range one day because he thought, I haven't played since I was a kid. I want to. He was 6'3" and left-handed, so the odds were against him. But and he was over 50. So I said, okay, well, we'll give it a shot. And I told him the story of Francis that day. And I'd never written nonfiction. I'd never written about golf. He said, no, you stop right there. This is a book and you have to write it. I said, really? And he said, yeah. So I went off the course and got on the phone, and I found the Francis Ouimet Foundation in Boston. And the director at that time, a great guy named Bob Donovan, who was running it. And I got on a plane a few days later and flew to meet him. And I wanted to get their permission, and I wanted to talk to Francis's daughters and get their permission. And I met Eddie Lowery's daughter, Cynthia, and I was stunned that no one had ever done this. And I spent the next year researching it.
Think of the confluence of events, though. You got, in your own way, you met Eddie Lowery, who's an essential character to this book that we're looking at here, The Match. Is there,
That's what introduced me to Eddie. It was through all of these connections, because as you may or may not know, Francis Ouimet later on, never turned pro, became a stockbroker with Brown Brothers Harmon in Boston. And among his clients were Eddie Lowery, who was his lifelong friend, who became one of the leading Lincoln Mercury dealers in America and a multimillionaire, and two young salesmen who worked for him, who were both ace amateur golfers, Ken Venturi and Harvey Ward. So when I met Ken for the first time, I think we had lunch at Bel Air Country Club, and I hadn't heard this story, and he told it to me over lunch, and I was obviously riveted. And just as I had to do with everybody associated with Francis, I really needed to win Ken's trust too, because this was literally, we'd first met, and I was just there to get kind of deep background on Francis and Eddie. So I cultivated a friendship with Ken over the next year or so, and spent a lot of time with him. And I said, finally, I think we should do this book. I mean, we've got you. Harvey was gone. Hogan was obviously gone. Byron was still alive.
Yep. And
I flew down to Fort Worth and spent an afternoon with him when he was 96 or 97, I think. And a lot of people, there were people at Cypress who had witnessed the match, who were my only real eyewitnesses to it. No journalists covered it. Very few people even knew about it. So I got an account from George Coleman's widow. George Coleman was the kind of the big player. He was in a bunch of businesses, but he started and backed Ben Hogan's golf club venture. Ben Hogan Golf Club started with George Coleman's money. And he knew Ben probably better than anybody. He had died some years before, but he and Eddie Lowery were the guys who made the bet at Bing Crosby's house. So his widow, I believe her name was Dawn, I think in her 90s at this point, after I contacted her, said, I've found a tape of George telling the story at a dinner party. Would you like to have it?
Hello.
I said, yeah. So I did get George's point of view on tape, and I did get Eddie Lowery's. Eddie had written like a 15 to 20 page version of the story that he'd left with his daughter. So I had his perspective on it. So I kind of was able to triangulate it. The guy who was the starter at Cypress, Joey, and I forget his last name, he was still around. So I got his end of it too. And so I felt I had enough to kind of piece it all together. And then I had, the primary resource was Ken. And I think because up to that day, this was probably facing his two greatest heroes with Harvey in this match and on that course where he had grown up and caddied. It was the biggest day of his life up until then. So he remembered, Ken had a great memory. He could remember shots 30 years ago. Yeah. It took a little time. We had to kind of prime the pump. He started, it was almost like he put himself in a time machine and went back and started recalling details, who was wearing, what the wind was doing, what the clouds were like, where the pins were. I mean, he remembered it all. It was as
the
if
drives were five. His drive and Hogan's on one hole were 5 yards apart. He knew that fact. That's incredible.
Yeah, he had it all. Even on the 13th, when they all made birdie. There was a great event. Getting ahead of this a little bit, after the book came out in 2012, I think it was, Ken had been notified by the Golf Hall of Fame he was going to be admitted that year. And they had decided, there's the First Tee organization, which has a yearly tournament at Pebble. And they had decided to invite Ken and I as two of the guests of honor for the event. There was a tournament, and the fun part was the tournament was the first day at Pebble, big dinner that night at Pebble, I think. The next day we recreated the match.
Thanks for joining us today.
Billy Harmon.
We really appreciate your
Double
feedback.
Indemnity.
And please
Arkie.
subscribe to the
Two
show
Outer.
and hit
Claude
the bell
Harmon.
icon so you get notified.
Movie Classics.
New episodes.
Mark Gable.
Hit 'em hard
Job.
and hit 'em off.
Best 36 holes.